everybody, welcome back to Bible from the Duns. Today we're in 1 Kings chapter 22, so let's get into it.
Okay, by the point you get to 1 Kings 22, you know two things. Number one, this is the last chapter of the book of 1 Kings, but it's also the end of the life of the most wicked king that Israel had, and his name was King Ahab. Now here's what's happening. In the previous chapter, Ahab had been so wicked, not just nationally, but then started targeting individuals like Naboth for his vineyard, that God had said, this is enough, it's time to get rid of you, it's time to judge, it's time to move on, it's time for a blank slate and see what happens, right? So this is the chapter where King Ahab dies, and he dies in battle. Now, one of the more interesting things about this to me is that when Ahab dies in battle, he partners with, remember, Ahab is the king of the northern part of Israel. There's another guy who's the king of the southern part of Israel. And the reason why they're tied up is because the southern king had married Ahab's daughter. And so it was just kind of family dynamics, and he went with the in-laws on this thing. He shouldn't have, but anyway, that's kind of another story. So they go into this battle, and the king of the southern says, I'll wear my robes, we'll go into battle like normal. Ahab says, I'm going to put on armor, I'm going to go fight with the people. Well, that kind of makes him look brave, but until you realize Ahab isn't really a man of the people. He's never been a man of the people. He throws them in jail. He hunts them down. He kills the prophets. He murdered or had Naboth, the Jezreelite, had him killed for his vineyard. Ahab is not a man of the people. He really is just kind of, he's a little boastful. And so when you read through this story, both of these kings now are wanting to go to war because the cities that Israel used to own had been taken over by Ben-Hadad. This is the same guy that Ahab had gone to battle with earlier, and instead of killing him, he called him up in the chariot and he made him his brother. He said, well, there's my brother Ben-Hadad. Well, listen, their treaty never went through. So again, not only did he sin, but he never got what the victory should have brought him in the first place. And so he wants to go and get him. And so he gets his son-in-law and his army. He said, go with me. In this story, the son-in-law I like. He says, I'm willing to go to battle. He says, I'm willing to join, but I've got to do it on one condition. It's got to be God's will for us. And so what does Ahab do? He calls in the prophets. Now, he's probably got a whole collection of prophets. The problem is they're on the payroll. And so he calls in all these guys, and they're telling him what he wants to hear. And basically, it seems to be so obvious that they're just kind of telling him what he wants to hear, because the other king is like, hey, you got anybody else we can call? Oh, Ahab says, well, there's one guy. I know him, but I hate to talk to him because every time I ask him anything, he always tells me, he never speaks good of me. Well, they call him in anyway, probably. It's possible that this prophet, his name is Micaiah, he was probably already in jail. And so his officers had to go get him out of jail from Ahab's prison to bring him back. And you can tell they kind of coach him the whole time. They're like, hey, look, everybody's saying this, you just say it, and it's all going to work out. The messengers tried to coach him on, listen, don't rock the boat. You know how the king is. Don't mess this thing up. And I mean, you can imagine the peer pressure. So earlier in the story, we saw Elijah going up against 450 prophets and on top of Mount Carmel. That meant one against everybody. Now you got Micaiah. He's in a similar battle, but it's a battle of peer pressure. Peer pressure is not a new thing. Peer pressure is an always thing. And so he comes on the scene, and I like it because he's just kind of sarcastic. He's like, oh yeah, do whatever you want. And Ahab knows he's messing with him. He says, what do I got to do? He said, look, here's what you need to know. You gonna die. And Ahab, like Ahab being Ahab, says, no. I'm the master of my own destiny. And of course, we know what happens. What was your big moments you saw in this story?
Okay, so what I like about this chapter is we see this kind of juxtaposition between Ahab and Jehoshaphat. And this is kind of like the difference between a good king and a bad king. And that difference is also that of a godly man and an ungodly man. And so we see this like most prominently in like verse 5 where it says, but Jehoshaphat said to the king of Israel, please ask what the Lord's will is. For the king of Israel gathered the prophets, about 400 men, and asked them, should I go to Ramoth Gilead for war, or should I refrain? They replied, march up, and the Lord will hand it over to the king. But Jehoshaphat asked, isn't there a prophet of the Lord here anymore? Let's ask him. So we see King Ahab turning to man, and we see him turning also to these people who he knows is going to tell him what he wants to hear, because that's what he pays them to do. But Jehoshaphat is much wiser than King Ahab in that he goes straight to God, and he doesn't want to hear what like they necessarily want to hear. He wants to hear what's going to happen and what they actually need to do, like no matter how hard it is. And so we kind of see this, and it also talks about Ahab's death and Jehoshaphat's reign. And when you compare these two side by side, Jehoshaphat, it was much more successful in terms of being godly and also in terms of being a king even. And while Ahab, he struggled with his relationship with God, and it was pretty much non-existent. And his time reigning over Israel was a struggle for the entire nation.
Yeah. My favorite part of this story is that Micaiah, the prophet, he is given a vision in heaven of angels and kind of angelic bodies talking with God. And really it's kind of a situation where they're doing all of this so that the prophet can see how it all unfolds, about tricking Ahab to go into battle. Now, a lot of people think that whenever you read this, you go, well, did God lie to Ahab? Well, that's tricky whenever you read this story. There's a lot of ambiguity kind of going on, but you got to remember what's going on. First of all, verse 19 says, then Micaiah said, therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing by on his right hand and on his left. So not just some. You know, years ago, the angels had basically a civil war, and now they're angels and they're demons. Well, this says all of the host of them showed up. And so some of them had the idea, we'll just lie to him. Well, those are probably the bad guys. Because remember, in the book of Job, even Satan has to show up, right? And so the Lord allows Satan to do various things to Job, but the Lord is going to work it together for good, both in his heart and in his life. But what I like about that is the story there, that vision begins with God on the throne, but the whole chapter begins with Jehoshaphat and Ahab both on their throne. And you got to ask the question, who's really the king on the throne? It's the Lord. Now, while Ahab sits on the throne in verse 10, God is sitting on the throne, the real throne. I want you to notice here that whenever you look to this, how Ahab was deceived, you got to notice, number one, God never lied. Number two, he did allow a lying spirit to, just like he allowed Satan to come against Job. He allowed this to happen to Ahab, but God also revealed to Ahab that he was being lied to. So there's a lot of forces at work, but God tells Ahab up front, he said, he sends a prophet to say, here's exactly what's going on. And Ahab didn't receive the warning. Micaiah, the prophet, is a hero of faith because he faithfully tells the truth, even though it brings him affliction. He's thrown in jail for just telling the truth. So listen, then Ahab goes into battle, and it says in verse number 34, look, this is now a certain man drew a bow at random, struck the king of Israel between the joints of his armor, so that he said to the driver of a chariot, turn around and take me out of the battle. So look, I think this is being a little facetious. So you're telling me a random man has a random shot that hits with perfect precision between the crack in a perfect little place of armor.
What a coincidence.
What a coincidence, unless it's not a coincidence at all. Because Ahab cannot hide from judgment. I want to tell you, when you read through Ahab's story, his story of wickedness and judgment is meant to warn us to repent, repent, repent. That even the king cannot hide from the judgment of the king when he's living outside of his will. And if the king can't, then certainly the average people can't either. So what do we take away from this? Repent, repent, repent. Walk with God. All right? We'll see you tomorrow as we start a new book of the Bible. See you later.
Bye.
Bye.